Hello, my name is Kevin Howard, and I'm the host of Breadcrumbs, a podcast for people who know it's not working. What a crazy time we live in these days. Regime change in Venezuela, ICE actually shooting a woman in the face, 2 million Americans living in their cars, while another million Americans live on the street. Let's just take a moment and breathe. Good. For those of us, and I don't mean this in a negative way, clutching our pearls at the brazenness of President Trump, I offer the poetic wisdom of one of my favorite music groups, the Talking Heads. It's the same as it ever was. Episode 17 of Breadcrumbs, I will focus our conversation on how the economics and the geopolitics that produced broad prosperity historically in the global north and in America in particular came at the price of severe exploitation and extreme violence of the broad populations of the global south. Now, as with all our conversations here on Breadcrumbs, we start from a place where we can relate to each other. And that place is our shared experiences and our shared humanity. And the reason why we do this is because the goal of this conversation that I hope you will engage in by putting your comments in the notes is to have an understanding, for me to communicate to you and you to communicate to me in a way that we come away from the conversation gaining information that is neither triggering or divides us, but actually brings us together. And so the basis of us doing that is we will use, as opposed to me trying to convince you of anything, we will use our shared experiences as a baseline, a reference point to assess whether or not the information that we're discussing is true, that it actually makes sense, that it's actually consistent with what your lived experience has been. And let me be clear, certainly there's new information, right? And there are contrasts in what we've been told and what I actually say. But the shared experience part is the series of prevailing narratives that you were told and that I was told that gave us an understanding of these events as they occurred, that the new information that I provide will give you some perspective on, and that you could verify that new information through either the links that I put as notes to this episode or by going into your version of ChatGPT and actually verifying the facts. We are now empowered to do that in real time, and I encourage you to do that. And if you find some error in what I say or something that doesn't resonate, this is what the conversation is supposed to be all about. You holding me accountable, you telling me what your experiences are, you sharing what resonates and what does not. Because at the end of the day, we are humans. We are neighbors. We grew up in the same world, most of us in the same country, many of us in the same neighborhood. And therefore, we have a lot of things a lot of shared values and shared experiences and our literal shared humanity that should be the basis by which we can have these difficult and sometimes third rail conversations without offending each other. Because my goal is not to offend you. My goal ultimately is to show through this podcast that we're just one human family and that there's been a lot of reasons we've been encouraged to hate each other. So, on to this episode of Breadcrumbs. I begin the conversation with Franklin Delano Roosevelt's second vice president. Now you're saying, what the hell? I mean, this is 2026, Kevin. Can we stay here? Everything that we are experiencing today can best be understood through the lens of the history that led to it. And you will see that's a consistent methodology in this podcast. Okay. So it is relevant. So stick with me, hang with me, why I'm going back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's second vice president. His name was Henry Wallace, and he served as FDR's vice president from January 1941 to January 1945. And he was an interesting person. And the reason why is, in my view, he is pivot point in our history, the history that we've come to understand since World War II, which is there were two lanes at least. And one of them was the vision of Henry Wallace that none of us got to experience. And the other is what we actually got to experience, the Cold War and everything else that came thereafter. Okay. So Henry Wallace was a liberal. He was a progressive. He was a true believer in Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal idea that wealth, in order to save capitalism, was going to shift some of the benefits of capitalism back to working people so that they would recommit to the capitalist model. The idea that a person's work can produce the kind of living that allowed them to participate in the American dream. So, yeah, Henry Wallace was a true believer in that and a visionary in that respect. And so FDR, going into his third term, picked Henry Wallace to be his vice president. And this was not well received by wealthy industrialists in the United States in 1941. And the reason why is because Henry Wallace was a man of the world. He was a visionary who saw the humanity beyond the nationalism, beyond the politics, even beyond who happened to be our enemies. And wealthy industrialists didn't like that because they benefit. They actually capitalize on our divisions. It's always been this way, and it will always be this way. And so Henry Wallace was sort of a threat to that because he was talking about oneness. He's talking about unity. He's talking about shared prosperity, right? And so one of Henry Wallace's goals was to bring shared prosperity, to bring the New Deal to the entire world. How about that? And so when he started to serve as vice president, because he was so dynamic, FDR put him in charge of the agencies that managed the resources that supplied the military during World War II. Because here we are engaged in a world war against Germany and Japan and Italy. Our allies were Great Britain and the Soviet Union and China. France had already fallen. And so here we are in the middle of a world war. But Henry Wallace was talking about what it was going to be after the war. What exactly were we fighting for? Who exactly were we fighting against in terms of organizing principles for society? And so Henry Wallace's most famous speech during his tenure as vice president was a speech called Century of the Common Man. And he gave this speech on May 8th, 1942. I will put the link in the notes for this podcast. I just want to read an excerpt from the speech that Henry Wallace gave to give you an idea of what his vision was post World War II. The peace must mean a better standard of living for the common man, not merely in the United States and England, but also in India, Russia, China, and Latin America. Not merely in the United Nations, but also in Germany, Italy, and Japan. Some have spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering, the century which will come into being after this war, can be and must be the century of the common man. Yeah, that was Henry Wallace. Now, I'm just telling you, that was a shot across the bow from the billionaire class of that time, the wealthy industrialists of that time, as it would be to the wealthy industrialists and the billionaires of this time. Okay. And so extreme wealth and power started building up once Henry Wallace gave the speech, and based on his life's work, they understood the threat that he was to what their plans were post World War II. And so they started lobbying Franklin Delano Roosevelt very hard during his administration to take away the high visibility authority that Henry Wallace had given to manage the munitions, to manage the resource supplies and equipment going to support the war effort. And so after a few years in office, they were successful in getting FDR to put him in a less visible position, particularly as it related to the war effort. And so what that did was, it took away basically most of his day job, right? Because he was running these two major agencies. And so what FDR did was, and what the industrialists intended, in terms of the mothball, Henry Wallace, return him to the status of traditional vice presidents who just cut ribbons and kiss babies or whatever and just chat up and sit over there in the corner and look good. That's what they wanted to happen with Wallace. What FDR did was, okay, I will send him, since he's a visionary as it relates to the New Deal, send him on a world tour. So during World War II, during 1943, Henry Wallace was sent around Latin America, around the Western Hemisphere. He was sent around the world. And what he did was give these speeches like a century of the common man. And he became, beyond FDR, the most popular American politician in the world. Not exactly what the industrialists wanted. So now they were worried. And why were they worried? As we're coming into 1944, FDR's health was starting to fail. Now, he had polio. He was in a wheelchair. This was a factor of his presidency when he got elected in 1932, and it progressively got worse over the years. But it looked like he was getting close to the end of his life. So they understood that if he survived to run again, he probably would not survive that term, that fourth term. And so they saw it as crucial that Henry Wallace not be his vice president for that fourth term. But their problem is Henry Wallace had become the most popular American politician beyond FDR in the world. What they did, what money and power and wealth always do. They start cutting the deals behind the scenes. And so when you go to the 1944 Democratic Convention, you have a situation where the delegates show up. FDR is by far the most popular politician. He's going to win easily. So his nomination is not in question. So they already have nominated FDR to be the Democratic nominee for president, and he's going to win the presidency. There's no confusion over whether he's going to win the presidency. But then they move on to the nomination, the night where they nominate the vice presidential nominee. And the crowd is booming. It is all the Wallace supporters. Again, he's extremely popular. It's going to be a landslide nomination. And so the power brokers see that, oh, this ain't working. This is getting out of control. We're about to lose this thing right here. And so what they did is before they could take the vote, which would have absolutely won the nomination for Henry Wallace, they actually suspended the festivities for the day. Someone quickly put in a motion, someone second the motion, and they shut it down. Yeah, shut down the convention. Fans are cheering. Everyone's ready to nominate Henry Wallace. In that overnight period, that's when I don't know what they do. The bribes were out, the deals were cut, babies were kidnapped and taken. No, I don't know about babies kidnapped, but whatever they do, all of a sudden, when the convention started the next day, a movement had been shifted towards Harry Truman. Harry Truman, a Midwesterner, was decidedly anti-communist, anti-Soviet. And so this was their guy because a part of their plan, and there is much literature on this, but there was a growing movement both in the UK and in the United States to make the Soviet Union our enemy as soon as we defeated Hitler and Mussolini and the emperor in Japan. Okay. And so Harry Truman was the guy who, if he became vice president and FDR, most people anticipated he would not survive, he would be the president who would usher in the post-World War II world. So they finally had their guy. And so the first vote, despite all their arm twisting, despite all their deals cutting and stuff like that, Henry Wallace still had a clear majority of the votes, but they were able to skim enough off the top that he didn't get enough to get the nomination. So they had to go to round two. And this is where I imagine babies start disappearing and phone calls start being made. And if you don't start voting this way over here, you're never seeing the baby again or whatever. Or we're coming out with your girlfriend. Yeah, the pictures of you in the hotel. Yes, we got the pictures. So you ought to make this vote. Whatever they did, all of a sudden, the most popular politician in the country besides FDR, second round, actually lost the nomination to Harry Truman. Okay. So there we have it. Henry Wallace should have been nominated, would have been nominated if the people who vote for the president, the people who vote for these politicians had their way. The delegates who were there were ready to do it. No, Howard got their way, finagled, cajoled, bribed to get their man, Harry Truman. So FDR goes on and he wins the 1944 presidential general election. And FDR and Harry Truman get sworn into office January 20th, 1945. By March of 1945, the great powers on the Allied forces, FDR, Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Great Britain, and Joseph Stalin, the premier of the Soviet Union, get together at the Yalta Conference. Because by March of 1945, the German forces were on the edge of defeat. Interestingly enough, so were the Japanese forces in the Pacific. And what these leaders were deciding is how to end the war quickly with minimum further deaths on their side. So you had two different problems. Okay. You had the defeat of Germany, which was going well. And let me be clear. Everyone at the Yalta Conference in March of 1945 understood that it was the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front that had broken the back of the Nazi military in World War II. That 10 times the fighting had occurred on the Eastern Front as had occurred with Great Britain and the United States on the Western Front and the Southern Front coming across Africa and up through Italy. Just to go over some basic data without getting too immersed, America lost 250,000 soldiers in Europe in World War II. Great Britain lost about 400,000 between the two of us. The Soviet Union lost, well, total minimum consensus across historians, minimum 20 million people at the hands of the Nazis on the Eastern Front, including over 8 million Red Army soldiers. The Germans lost millions of soldiers, not to us, but to the Red Army in the Eastern Front. And what broke Germany was the fact that the Soviet Union refused to surrender. And so to give you some comparison of the magnitude of the sacrifice that the Soviet Union made in order to defeat Nazi Germany, right? France, who fought bravely, lost about 500,000 people before they surrendered in 1940. So if you consider that if the Soviet Union had surrendered after the first 5 million deaths, based on the fact that they lost a minimum of 20 million in 4 years, they attacked the Soviet Union in June of 1941, and ultimately Germany surrendered in June of 1945, 4 years. So if they surrendered after the first 5 million deaths, that would have put them in the middle of 1942, just when we were just arriving. After Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. So by the time we arrived in Europe in the spring and summer of 42, if the Soviet Union had surrendered and the Nazis could go and put all their forces, most of their forces, move the 200 divisions that were fighting against the Red Army to fight against the British and the Americans, contemplate how many American deaths it would have taken to defeat them and how many British deaths it would have taken to defeat them. I assure you, the 250,000 people who died, soldiers who died, and the 400,000 British are a shadow of what would have happened if the Soviet Union had surrendered after the first 5 million deaths. And who could have blamed them? Right? But instead, they fought on. And so my point here is everyone at the Yalta Conference in March of 1945 understood it was the Soviet Union who broke the back of the Germans. In fact, the world understood this. And so the strategy that was being discussed at the Yalta Conference was less about the defeat of Germany, which was certain, but over convincing the Japanese to surrender before we had to go on the island and fight there. Because that was the concern in terms of the maximum amount of American and Chinese deaths fighting against the Japanese is if we had to go town to town on the island of Japan. That would have been, everyone agreed, devastating on both sides. And so what was hindering the Japanese was what we wanted. We wanted absolute surrender. We wanted absolute surrender from the Germans. We wanted absolute surrender from the Japanese. And what that meant is we plan on executing these leaders. This can give you an idea of why Hitler committed suicide instead of waiting around and being executed. And this is why the Japanese absolutely refused. They were going to fight to the last person because they would not accept the execution of the emperor. And they were willing to die for that. And basically what they were saying to us is, are you willing? How many Americans are you willing to lose in order to kill our emperor? Because we will go to the last person. And so to the counter to that was, well, they could question America's commitment and how many Americans we were willing to die for this cause. but no one in the world was going to question the Soviet Union's commitment. So FDR came up with the brilliant idea, and he started having this conversation with Stalin in 1944. But he asked Stalin at the Yalta Conference in March of 1945 if the Soviet Union would do in the Pacific what they were willing to do in Europe, send the Red Army to fight the Japanese on the island of Japan in order to convince them to surrender. Okay. And Stalin, a true ally, agreed. And he said, okay, 3 months. I need 3 months. But 3 months after Germany surrenders, I will have the Red Army in the Pacific and we will declare war on Japan. FDR agreed. And that became the strategy to end the war in the Pacific that FDR had intended. Best laid plans. April 1945. FDR dies. They knew it was going to happen. They just didn't know when. But power and wealth got their way. Because instead of Henry Wallace being the president of the United States, who would have executed bringing the New Deal to the world, including our enemies, including Germany and Japan and Italy and the Soviet Union, instead of that person being the president of the United States, who would have certainly honored the agreement with Stalin to send the Red Army to convince the Japanese it's not necessary for us to fight to the last man. But if you want to fight to the last man, we got the team to do that. Red Army's coming. Ask Hitler what they did. Okay. Said we got Harry Truman. And so May 7th or 8th of 1945, Germany surrenders. And just like clockwork, 3 months later, June, July, August 7th, the Soviet Union Red Army is on the ground in the Pacific. They declare war against Japan. But the day before, on August 6th, and 2 days later, on August 9th, Harry Truman preempts what the Soviet Union would have done, which was end the war without one American death going on the island of Japan. Instead, Harry Truman drops the 2 atomic bombs on Japan, on civilian populations in Japan. And let's be clear about the significance of us dropping those 2 bombs. America remains, to this day, the only nation in the world to drop a nuclear bomb on a civilian population. And let's not get it twisted. The Soviet Union had many opportunities to do the same. And I'll just name one. The war in Afghanistan during the 1980s in the Reagan administration. Now you're like, Kevin, what are you talking about? And why is that relevant? It's hugely relevant, and you will know in a moment. Okay. So in the mid-70s, in the spread of communism, the government in Afghanistan became communist. Yes, I'm sure it was influenced by the Soviet Union, no question about it. I'm not taking sides in that regard. There was a communist government in the Soviet Union. And our efforts to defeat communism wherever it spread was to finance counterinsurgencies in Afghanistan to overthrow that communist government. It started under Jimmy Carter in 79, where we started funding a group, an Islamic militia called the Mujahideen. And we financed them. And we trained them. And we trained them based on what the Soviet to the extent that they were going to support the communist government in Afghanistan, because we were successful in overthrowing that government immediately. But what happened is the Soviet Union sent the Red Army into Afghanistan in the early 1980s to defend and stand up and stiffen the back of the communist government in Afghanistan. And so we trained the Mujahideen and gave them specialized arms to defeat the equipment that the Soviet Red Army was using in Afghanistan. And we made a movie with Tom Hanks called Charlie Wilson's War. I'll put the link in the notes. Check it out. Okay, celebrating how the Mujahideen, through our training and the equipment we gave them, by 1989, broke the back of the Red Army in Afghanistan and who had to retreat back into the Soviet Union, a defeated army. And it wasn't just happenstance that the Soviet Union chose to disband, to stand down just 2 years later in 1991. So here was an opportunity where, through conventional means, in a ruggedly rural country like Afghanistan, that the Soviet Union was facing defeat, and they could have used tactical nuclear weapons in Afghanistan. It would not have hurt who? It was not going to be, again, tactical nukes are small scale nuclear weapons. They could have done that to defeat the Mujahideen and defend the Afghan communist government in Afghanistan. They chose to accept conventional defeat instead of doing it. So when I say, back to Harry Truman's decision to drop 2 atomic bombs on civilian populations in Japan, for a reason that most historians say did not have to happen, because the Red Army was prepared to do the fighting on the island of Japan instead of the US military having to do it themselves, right? Okay, even just pointing out the significance. No one else, all the people we vilify, no one else has made the decision that Harry Truman made, and that wasn't necessary to make on August 6th and August 9th, 1945. Okay, but there it is. He did it. And by the end of September, Japan surrendered. But what he did was to send a message to Stalin that we have these bombs. Stalin, by most records, did not know we possessed an atomic bomb. And the statement, the message to Stalin is, if you're not careful, you're next. Because what we did then, after securing the surrender of Japan, and Germany had already surrendered, is that we started the process of rebuilding these countries. So now just contemplate the idea that as a country, you sacrifice 8.7 million soldiers, at least 20 million total, including civilians, people, to defeat an enemy, and your ally commits to rebuilding them. We call it the Marshall Plan, to rebuilding them, while at the same time making us the enemy. I mean, yes, I have said it before in a previous podcast, and I'm saying it again in this one. And I want you to put your notes in the comment if you disagree. That America making the Soviet Union the enemy after World War II is the greatest betrayal at the national level in global history. Full stop. The fact that in 1963, President Kennedy, in his famous speech on peace, acknowledged, in his own words, no nation in the history of war has sacrificed more than the Soviet Union did in World War II. And yet, we made them the enemy. And why? As I told you, the rich industrialists did not want Henry Wallace, because Henry Wallace was not going to make the Soviet Union an enemy. Henry Wallace was going to bring the New Deal to the world. Yes, we were going to rebuild Germany. Yes, they're humans. Yes, we were going to participate in rebuilding Japan, but we were going to do the same for the Soviet Union. And the difference in the economics and the difference in the politics amongst free people is that if our system is better, then we'll do our system. And if their system is better, then we'll do their system. That is competition. That is supposed to be an American virtue, not amongst these industrialists. They're not about competition. They're not about freedom. They are about winning. They're about getting their way however they need to get it. Arms twisted, babies kidnapped, you know, private pitches exposed, whatever they need to do by any means necessary. And our shared experience has demonstrated that they are committed to that all the way up to today. Okay. So instead of having a world where we come together in peace and becomes the century of the common man, we launch the Cold War. We give the military industrial complex what is truly essential for their vision of economics and geopolitics. A massive enemy. We make the Soviet Union an enemy. And so this defines the post-World War II period. Now, the irony of the post-World War II period is that when you look at 1946 to 1980, I like to call this period, from a U.S. domestic perspective, the Pax Americana. Why? Because this was the period of greatest American economic equality. Notwithstanding the segregation issues, issues of race and gender issues, gender bias issues, and all that was alive and well during that period of time, and only started to unravel as that period of time came to an end, 60s, 70s, that type of thing. In terms of pure economics, by every measure, this was the period of greatest American equality. And why? Because the provisions of the New Deal that FDR was able to establish leading into World War II were then followed up with the new GI Bill, the VA loan program, which gave the returning soldiers new generations of Americans who had never been exposed to going to college or to owning a home were now able to do that. And by going to college, that means they were able to improve their skills. And what that did was produce the greatest middle class and working class in American history and probably global history, though I'm sure there are some smaller European countries, particularly in Scandinavia, who have exceeded that by now. But for that period of time, 1946 to 1980, there it was. And an independent economic metric that measures the wealth and income inequality is called the Gini coefficient. And so it confirms this because in a context where the Gini coefficient measures whether an economy is equal or unequal, the most equal the U.S. economy has been was 1969. Yeah. And 23 years after the end of World War II. And it has steadily gone down ever since. Okay. So even at the peak of American prosperity for most of us, the period where we actually achieved shared prosperity, and to give some real clarity to where we were in 1970 from an economic standpoint, Hollywood, TV, culture merely mirrors where the society is. And so one of the great comedy writers, a gentleman named Norman Lear, produced one of his most popular shows, All in the Family, early 70s. And the main character of All in the Family is Archie Bunker. Right? Archie Bunker was the everyman of the white working class in America. And the great thing about All in the Family is it gave you an image because here you had Archie Bunker, non-college educated, unionized longshoreman. He's unloading and loading ships on the dock, was able to own a home in a major American city. Queens is in New York. Queens, New York is in New York City. He was able to own a home and send his daughter Gloria to college on his salary alone. That is where the white working class was in 1970. That wasn't Fantasy Island. That was normal. His neighbor was George Jefferson, who was a, an owner of a local cleaners that did well. And so this was like the comparison. Norman Lear was brilliant. This was the comparison of where Black America was compared to white America is we were at a place desegregated where a Black business owner could own a home and live next to the white working class. That was a snapshot of where we were in 1970. Okay. But the problem with that is that wealth saw, after having 20 years of this shared prosperity, that it didn't come free. And what do you mean, Kevin? What are you talking about? Well, by 1970, we had the civil rights movement. We had the equal rights movement. We had the anti-war movement. What was going on college campuses in America is they became a melting pot of brilliant young activists who had the education, the critical thinking to challenge the prevailing narratives, to challenge the narrative of that justified the Vietnam War, that exposed the Gulf of Tonkin as a lie, that it's not worth Americans or killing anyone over preventing the communism from spreading across some artificial longitudinal line. So Wells saw that as a threat. Why? Because they were making a bunch of money using the military industrial complex, vilifying the Soviet Union, creating the Cold War so that we can build up a permanent armistice monster that President Eisenhower warned us about in January 1961 before he left office, the dangers of the military industrial complex and how it will ultimately be a threat to our democracy and our freedoms. The people who were benefiting from that system saw that after 24 years of shared prosperity, the problem with Americans where the working class could afford to own their own homes and take vacations and have pensions, non-contributory pensions and stuff like that, was they had the time and the energy and the education and the information from a working class media. Remember, even Walter Cronkite never earned six figures. He was middle class at the peak. What Wealth had learned was that we can't control them. We've lost control of the narrative. The narrative allows us to control them, allows us to make the money how we want to make the money. That is not by being fair. That is not by being competitive. That is by rigging the damn game all over the place and using war and safety and security as a basis for making money. Yeah, this is the very thing, President Eisenhower warned us against. Okay, well, here we are. And this is not conspiracy. This was written, there's a letter written by Lewis Powell in August of 1971 it's famously called the Powell Memo. It was a letter that he wrote to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He was a powerful corporate attorney. And I will put the link to this podcast here. He said in his letter, very scholarly, everything seems proper. You would not think that there's any danger associated with it. So read it. It's legible. It's understandable. Basically, he said, the American corporation, i.e., wealth, because that's the corporation is the vehicle by which wealth gains their wealth, had lost control. I mean, all hell done broke loose. He didn't say it that way, but civil rights movement, equal rights movement, anti-war movement. He didn't even know the media was about to bring down a sitting president. That's how powerful we were. This is what shared prosperity does. It empowers us to hold power accountable. That is exactly what the forefathers, the design of our Constitution was intended to do. So they can't have that. Just like they couldn't have Henry Wallace in 1944. Oh, hell no. Century of the Common Man is about us. Okay, so what Lewis Powell said to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and to extreme wealth around this country is that in order to get control of this situation, you know, they had to spend more money than they've ever spent before to bend the will of the government, the media, and the university system to the interests of corporate America, i.e., extreme wealth. Okay, that is what he said. Read it. It's not conspiracy when they write it out. And then you can look at our shared experiences and see, did they do that? Because Lewis Powell then went on to be appointed by Nixon in 1972 to the U.S. Supreme Court, where he became one of the leading corporatist justices in U.S. history. If you want to know how corporations got recognized as people, welcome to Lewis Powell. Or if you want to know what led to Citizens United, where corporations became superheroes because they can contribute unlimited amounts of money to political campaigns, while we are limited to $6,000 or so each, right? So basically, we needed to share that because the billionaire owns the politician. Okay. This is what Lewis Powell said we must do. Spend more money than we've ever spent before to bend the will of our government, achieved through Citizens United. Our university system, achieved by outsourcing research and development to extract, to bribe the brightest professors out of the classroom and into research so that we are not teaching our kids how to think. Who's left in the classroom is the TA who cannot yet earn the privilege of getting bribed to do research. So that TA is in the classroom and we're reading the textbook by the notes. That's it. We're not learning critical thinking. Guess what? Deflated the university system of what it was doing in the 50s and 60s, which is raising a generation of Americans who can think, who can analyze information. Yeah, forget about that. Can't control people if they know how to do that. Yeah, mission accomplished. Look what happened to the media. The glory days of news media. Walter Cronkite. All those years, it was a public service division of the major networks. It was not for profit. It was supported by the entertainment division, right? But by 1979, Ted Turner and the creation of the for-profit news network allowed wealth to buy the talking heads. And so even though Walter Cronkite was never a millionaire, again, he never made six figures in his life. Okay. They started making millionaires out of these people. And once they made millionaires out of the talking heads, guess who controls the story? And look at our media. All of a sudden, CNN spawns Fox News, spawns MSNBC, and now we have media that is bought and paid for. Okay. Add Bill Clinton to his complicity with the 1996 Telecom Act that allowed wealth to consolidate media in very few hands. They used to be restricted to like 40% of different types of media, right? No, now they can buy everything. And now media is now dominated by less than five organizations. Oh, yeah. This is how they own the media, which is why Jon Stewart did such a wonderful job in the 2000s on The Daily Show. And all he was doing, primary method, was to show how talking heads up and down the chain from local to regional to national are reading from the same script. I mean, that's what he would do, story after story after story. And these idiots, oh, let's be British, these idiots right, would have the same copy. That's how owned the media became. Okay. So it's not conspiracy when we can see in our shared experience. Lewis Powell writes it. He goes to the Supreme Court. He makes the rulings to give the corporations the rights. The corporations buy the media. Now our politicians no longer listen to us, haven't listened to us in decades. Why? Because they're completely owned by wealth. Okay. And our media is completely co-opted. It's just a mouthpiece for power. There's no Woodward and Bernstein in this media right here holding power to account. Oh hell no. Complete shills, complete sellouts. Just shut Pulitzer down. Just right. That's what we're facing today. Okay. So they were successful in doing this. My point of pointing this stuff out was even at the period of greatest shared prosperity. What was going on at the same time as that shared prosperity was we were using the military industrial complex and starting the Cold War against the Soviet Union, in endeavoring to make them the enemy, to draw the line on the spread of communism, to purge, through McCarthyism, purge the American people of any pre-World War II affiliation with the Soviet Union or communism or socialism, and then to start building bases and funding counterinsurgencies. We started overthrowing countries left, right, and center. So during the Pax Americana, while we were benefiting in this country from shared prosperity, it was coming at the backs of this type of influence around the world. From 1946 to 1980, the US government documented, go check it out, go into your AI and check out what is plainly a matter of public record. We overthrew 13 governments between 1946 and 1980. Six in the Western Hemisphere. You think Venezuela is bad? Yeah, we even overthrew Brazil. Three in the Middle East, two in Asia, two in Africa. And if that's not bad enough, we intervened in 81 national elections. So while we are back in the States living good, sending our daughters, sons to college and whatever on our unionized income, getting pensions, what's happening around the world that is funding our lifestyle is the absolute torture, exploitation, killing of many, 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 many people, particularly in the global South. And we were being told wonderful stories of America, light on the hill. Yeah. But as I mentioned to you, so while that was going on, the basis of that exploitation and that severe violence and those overthrows of both leaders who were democratically elected and the persecution of their people, unless they came to work for us and our interests and gave us products and resources on the cheap that provided for our lives. Yeah. So that was the best of times, and that's how it was funded. And yet, wealth realized, oh, hell no, this is not working. We're losing control. They're actually stopping. They're trying to stop our train, right? When we ended the Vietnam War, that was a desperate threat to extreme wealth in this country because the military industrial complex is a vehicle by which they drive their economics. And so the war was on against us. And that's why they decided to break the back of shared prosperity. Why? Because if we had to focus all our energy on just surviving another day, we could not hold them to account. And our entire experience from 1980 all the way to 2026 has been a profound effort of breaking the back of shared prosperity, moving us closer and closer to homelessness, food insecurity, or what have you. And I'm asking you, don't just believe me. Look at the trend line of the whole swath of people in your life over the last 20, 30 years. If you haven't seen a steady and persistent degradation, going, whether it was a Republican in office or a Democrat in office, put it in the notes. There's always anomalies and always successes, right? I was that one of those anomalies and those successes until I realized on what basis I was earning that living. But so I'm not saying everyone degraded. I'm just saying broadly, the broad American public, the broad American middle class, the broad American working class have degraded. And every economic measure validates that, right? From 1980 to today. But during that period of time, we didn't stop the wars. We continued to overthrow nations. Another 11 nations got overthrown. Many, many elections were influenced or rigged in order to advance American domination in the world. For the benefit of us? No. For the benefit now of the wealthy alone. It used to be for our benefit, but not anymore. Once they broke the back of share prosperity because we start holding them accountable. How dare us? Then it was just, we became the enemy too. And that's what it feels like. And so this leads us to breadcrumb number one. Trump is not worse than his predecessors. He is just transparently committed to American domination within the context of this new, and it's new, three-party superpower framework. The United States, Russia, China. Okay. He announced as much through Secretary of State Rubio the first week of his administration when he went on to interview Megyn Kelly, interviewed Secretary of State Rubio, and he announced the age of American hegemony, U.S. as the world's only superpower, is over, and that we have entered into a period of three regional superpowers, the United States, Russia, and China. And that, unlike during American hegemony, when we were the only superpower, we didn't talk to and negotiate with anyone. They either did what we said or they were our enemy and we tried to destroy them. That's it. There was no communication. There was no diplomacy in that conversation. Okay. No, this is going to be a new day and that we will negotiate directly with our superpower nations. Okay. And we have seen this. Trump negotiates directly with Putin. Trump negotiates directly with Xi. So what does that look like? Well, before we get to what that looks like. So let me be plain. Okay. That is just transparent. He is not lying. He is just doing it, right? Okay. That is, as I've tried to say, this reason why this episode is called Same as It Ever Was, is that the difference between Trump and Obama is that Obama, like Bush, like Biden, like, like Clinton, right, wraps themselves, like Reagan, wraps themselves in freedom, democracy. Yeah, I'm bringing freedom to the world. All this nonsense all this stuff to think that they're doing good when underneath, as I have mentioned, they are killing, destroying, persecuting, torturing people around the world, extracting for the benefit of themselves natural resources, chopping up the most awful leaders. And you don't believe me? Okay. All right. It was Obama who, you want to know why we have a war in Ukraine? It was Obama in 2014. Go put this in your chat GPT. It was Obama in 2014 who was the president of the United States when we financed the violent overthrow of the democratically elected leader of Ukraine. It was Obama's Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, who the Russians caught on audio tape. Go listen to it yourself on YouTube, right? Who was saying in the beginning of February 2014 to the US ambassador to Ukraine, here are the people that we're going to put in government once we overthrow the existing democratic leader. And again, let's not get it twisted, right? The democracy in Ukraine was a valid democracy. They already had scheduled elections coming up in 2015. There was a reason why we did not want to wait for the elections because the majority of the Ukrainians were not pro-NATO. The majority of Ukrainians were not anti-Russian. We were anti-Russian, we were pro-NATO, and we wanted to put our people in place. And we did. And Victoria Nuland got caught predicting who we'd put in power. And then by the end of February, the uprising that we financed occurred. The democratically elected leader of Ukraine fled to Russia, and we installed a group of people who then started ethnically cleansing ethnically Russian Ukrainians in the Donbass area. And the conflict in Ukraine went on. Okay, that was Obama. Yes, all scholarly and all that. It was Obama who approved the policy to ally with Al Qaeda in order to overthrow Assad in Syria. Yeah. Go check out Tulsi Gabbard's confirmation hearing for the Director of National Intelligence last year and see the discussions of the establishment Republicans and establishment Democrats who were lambasting her for opposing our regime change in Syria of Assad because she refused to ally with Al Qaeda after they killed 3,000 Americans on 9/11. Okay, but it was Obama who approved that policy. Yeah, who apparently believes the enemy of my enemy is my friend, even if they kill 3,000 Americans. Yeah. So these are the predecessors. Joe Biden. Oh my God. It was Joe Biden who endorsed Netanyahu's argument that Israel cannot be committing genocide because they're only responding to the terrorist attack of Hamas on October 7th, 2023. Okay, sounds fair enough. Except that Senator Joe Biden in 1988 wrote and introduced the enabling legislation to make the Genocide Convention legal federal law in the United States as a part of the U.S. ratification process. In other words, before we could ratify the treaty, the Genocide Convention, we had to make it U.S. law, and then we report it to the United Nations as part of U.S. law, and that we are officially ratifying. Yeah. Joe Biden wrote the enabling legislation to make the Genocide Convention federal law in 1988. Okay, so the Genocide Convention is 4 pages long. I will put the link in the notes. Okay, if you want to know how it's impossible that Joe Biden did not know that genocide has no self-defense, defense is because he wrote the enabling legislation in 1988. He led that argument. That was him, right? The overall effort to get the Genocide Convention ratified was led by another senator. But the step in order to qualify for ratification is enabling federal legislation to make it federal law. And that's what Joe Biden wrote. Okay. And yet he stood before the world, before the United Nations, and he made an argument that he knew was absolutely untrue. There is no self-defense defense for genocide. Full stop. And the International Court of Justice on January 26, 2024 agreed. And they determined that Israel's argument in support of a summary judgment throwing out South Africa's case that they were committing genocide, Israel's argument was we could not be committing genocide because we're only responding to their terrorist attack. The court said no, that's completely invalid. In fact, based on the evidence that South Africa has presented, it looks like you're likely committing genocide. And then they went and did the extraordinary thing of issuing out emergency orders telling Israel to stop. Of course, they haven't. So, what I'm saying to you is the predecessors, like Joe Biden, like Obama, oh, Bush, I can go on and on. Weapons of mass destruction, convincing us to attack Iraq for reasons that proved to be untrue. On and on and on. These people the predecessors wrap themselves, wrap the terror that they're causing. The same obnoxious things that Trump is doing now, they wrap it in American liberty, in the desire for freedom, in the virtues and values that we've been convinced to live by. They wrap and justify their horrible, evil, treacherous acts in those things while they do the same treachery that we are clutching our pearls about with Donald Trump, right? He is just transparent. And to me, that's a good thing. Why? Because now we can see and we can look back at our experience, at our lived experience, and see, same as it ever was. Now the pretense, the mask has been lifted. So that's the first breadcrumb. Where does this leave us? Just I wanted to take a moment to say, where does this leave this three-party superpower framework leave us in terms of what Trump is doing real quick? I just wanted to say a comment on that before I move to breadcrumb number 2. These areas of influence. So the U.S. area of influence is the Western Hemisphere since the Monroe Doctrine, which was any country that attacks or interferes with any country in the Western Hemisphere is making an attack against the United States of America. In other words, this was us claiming that any country in the Western Hemisphere is within the sphere of influence of the United States, and that every country outside of the Western Hemisphere is on notice that not to mess in this area. Okay. So this is the first part of our area of influence. But that area of influence has expanded to Western Europe. And so America's area of influence is Western Europe and the Western Hemisphere. Russia's sphere of influence historically has been Eastern Europe, and now it's going to be the Middle East, parts of the Middle East. China's area of influence is Asia, parts of the Middle East, and Africa. But here's where I think Trump is trying to expand America's area of influence. And that's why I think we did that recent attack in Africa. I think he's trying to not cede the entire African continent to China. China has been investing in infrastructure in Africa for some decades now. And so they have a long head start. But I think Trump is trying to make a move to carve some of the natural resources of Africa into the American area of influence, to be continued. Okay. And so that leaves those 3 areas. Now, there's some independent parties that still haven't been resolved. I don't think India is going to be anyone's stepchild. So I think that they're too big and are a nuclear power in their own right. And so I think they're going to be an independent state. You would think a country like Brazil. They are a key member of BRICS, the BRICS coalition of nations. I think for now they'll be independent, but I think that there is going to be negotiations between Trump and Putin and Xi that BRICS will have to retreat out of the Western Hemisphere and Brazil will fall under American influence. I think that Venezuela is indicative of that reality, but more to come on that one. But I think the horse trading in that regard, to the extent that BRICS is going to give up Brazil, leaving Brazil to have to defend themselves against our imperialism, I think the horse trading is going to be Taiwan. I think the horse trading is going to be Israel in the Middle East, because those are in natural areas of influence for both China and Russia, not America. And I think Netanyahu kind of tipped us off to that vision that the period of Israel being completely sponsored and protected by the U.S. is coming to an end, because he even suggested, looking 10 years ahead, that Israel would not be getting military support and financing from the United States. And let me be clear, I'm not advocating for any of this. I'm saying that this seems to be what he's doing. And it seems to make sense in terms of why he nakedly is attacking Venezuela. Take a look at what Putin just announced in Ukraine. As Ukraine is about to fall, Putin has said, okay, we were willing to settle Ukraine at certain provinces within Ukraine, leaving a portion of Ukraine independent and stuff like that. You didn't take us up on those offers. Now, what we are demanding for the special military operation is for NATO to retreat back to the German border, which is what they promised to do, to go no further east of Germany when the Soviet Union stood down in 1991. The whole idea is that the Warsaw Pact nations, the Eastern European countries, would be a security buffer. In other words, neutral, not under the weight of Russia, but neutral. Like Austria became neutral in 1955 and the Red Army left Austria. Okay, that's what I believe Putin just said, is that NATO is going to be pushed back to Germany, and that the special military operation will not stop at Ukraine. So hear the rest of that story. This is why NATO will dissolve, because we are not going to go to war against Russia over Eastern Europe. That's what I believe. That's what Trump is saying. So the Europeans are desperately trying to get themselves organized in order to defend themselves. Too much, too little, too late. I think that's one of the things that demonstrate these superpowers coordinating together. Look at Chinese military operations around Taiwan. We're not going to defend Taiwan. This is a part of the agreement. So I do think that there is some coordination going on between Trump and Xi and Putin, and that within the context of their areas of influence, they're going to be given wide berth. And the only question is, what are the contours of those areas of influence? So that's my read on what Trump is actually doing and the new world order he's trying to establish. And the implications of that, in my opinion, is to all the countries within American influence. Or, well, how about this? If, depending on where you are as a nation, who is the superpower that you would fall within? And so Canada needs to take a look at what happened to Venezuela. Brazil needs to take a look at what happened in Venezuela. Absolutely. Denmark needs to seriously consider, if we could do this in Venezuela, do you doubt that Trump would do it in Denmark? And who in Europe is going to stop him? All I'm saying here is that these nations need to look at the reality of the situation. I'm not saying that they need to just give in. I'm just saying they need to take it seriously, and they need to start developing policy to work what deals that they can work to mitigate that risk. But back to the breadcrumbs. So, breadcrumb number 2. The reason why this episode is called same as it ever was, is that the only thing that's really changed is that extreme wealth is deploying the same tactics that they have deployed when things were good in America on the broad populations of the global south, all those countries, all those people exploited, all those murders, all the torture, all the manipulation, all those thrown elections. Yeah, all that activity that paid for our shared prosperity. The only thing that has changed is that now they're doing it to us. And it's not unique to the American middle class. It is not unique to the American working class. And oh, if you are in the American upper class, let me be plain, you are just next. This is a private party of extreme wealth who makes these decisions. I am not questioning your virtue for your success. I'm merely saying people in the working class who had prosperity worked hard for it too. People in the middle class who had prosperity worked hard for it too. And you in the upper class who have prosperity, you have absolutely worked hard for it too. This is not about fear. This is about power and control. And the people who are running things is the extreme wealth segment. And so you're next. Okay. But my point is that they are using it against us now. Those same techniques, pitting us against each other, exploiting our contributions as severely as they possibly can. And this is the case across the global north. If you look across Europe, if you look to the middle class and working class across Canada, I am telling it's the same thing what we're experiencing in the States. Why did Great Britain vote to exit the European Union? We scandalize those voters. But the working class and the middle class were not served by globalization. They were not. They did not benefit from it. Their conditions have only gotten worse. It's the kitchen table issue, not the hatred of immigrants that caused Great Britain to exit the European Union. And so, what the biggest driver to Trump getting reelected was the refusal to affirm Joe Biden's pick, Kamala Harris, because Kamala Harris said there's nothing she would do different. She could think of nothing that she would do different than Joe Biden. So I'm telling you, it wasn't, oh, we need a strong man. It was that we cannot affirm the same establishment who has driven us to the point where 2 million Americans are living in their car, where another million Americans are living on the street, where 52 to 54% of working class families in America are reporting food insecurity. No, we cannot affirm that by re-electing anyone who's saying that they're going to do the same thing. We will elect anyone who's not that. This is where we are. And so now that it's being done for us, can we see the wrongness in doing it to other people? Can we see that all of us who have been exploited, all of us who have been lied to, all of us who all we want is justice, all we want is peace, all we want is an environment where we can use our skills to take care of ourselves and our family, that we need to come together and build those communities that lead to those regions that lead to the kind of society that we would want for ourselves and our children and their children. This is where we are. Today in America, U.S. workers feel just like the Chinese workers who produce their iPhones. Yeah, the ones jumping out of the window, the ones locked in buildings for crazy periods of time to do the work. Yeah, when you look at the workers at Amazon, when you look at the workers at Walmart, when you look at the standard business as usual model across American industry and across American businesses, these businesses are producing billionaire families. Yeah. While the workers are making up to $15 an hour, piston in cups, getting fired by text, qualifying for food stamps. And yet, out of their work, the wealthiest families in America are just making more money. Yeah. This is what's happening in America. This is what's happening in Europe. This is what's happening around the global north in Canada. So what can we do now? Number 3, acknowledge that the story of America has always been built on the backs of exploited people. I have a commentary that I will put the link in the notes. And it just tells the history of the broken promise that America has become. Because we started off as a promise, and we had periods of time where we moved the needle on that promise. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created, all men created equal. Yeah, we expanded that to include women. We expanded that to include African Americans and immigrants, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, even atheists. But along the way, it's been a series of broken promises. So yeah, the story of America was always built on the backs of exploited people, same as it ever was. So we need a new story. We need an economics. We need society. We need communities that serve all of us. We need to stop fighting against people who are suffering just like we are. We need to recognize in each of us that we basically want the same thing: safety and security and a life of balance for ourselves, for our loved ones, for our children, our friends, for our community and our nation, for our world. And so we need to stop fighting against other people who are not causing our pain, who are not the source of the extraction. Because seriously, every problem we see, every major problem is being caused by a drain in the essential resources we need to solve them. And where are all the resources? They are consolidated in the wealthiest billionaire class ever. A billionaire class that's so wealthy that individual billionaires have as much wealth as the entire wealthy class of prior generations. Yeah, that wealthy. We're about to have our first trillionaire. Yeah. So I say to you, if we don't come together now, when? Because in my view, when you're dealing with a level of economic degradation from people who are not used to not being able to take care of themselves and their families, in a country that has more weapons, like we have about 500 million weapons in the United States. Yeah, I was blown away when I asked the ChatGPT about 500 million weapons in the United States. So when you're talking about a population who's used to taking care of themselves and their families, where 2/3 of the country makes less than $105,000 a year, but in order to achieve the basic American dream, home ownership, saving for retirement, sending the kids to school, having health care, taking a vacation, just the basics, is estimated to cost you a minimum of $150,000 a year, up to $220,000 a year, depending on where you live. Yeah, that is what the American dream costs. When the American dream is that far out of reach, we are at risk of losing social order. So if not now, when? Because I can tell you, once people take it to the streets, once they start grabbing the pitchforks and start coming up the hill, it's hard to have a conversation then. We need to come together. We need to work together to build local community that works for all of us. But now is the time, because the window will close and the alternatives are just, well, too scary to even say here on Breadcrumbs. So thank you for your time today. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Breadcrumbs. And I will see you next time in the conversation. You take care.